The Krell Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 17,000 years, and their empire stretched across 400 star systems, and they had conquered so many species that they stopped counting after the first 100, and their war strategy was simple and brutal because they would strike without warning and overwhelm their enemies with massive fleets, and leave no room for surrender or negotiation. And when their scouts detected radio signals coming from a small blue planet in the outer edge of the galaxy, they barely paid attention because the beings there called themselves humans, and they seemed primitive and weak, and completely unprepared for what was coming. Commander Vexthor stood on the bridge of his flagship called Eternal Dominance, and watched the third planet from the local star grow larger on his display screens, and the intelligence reports told him that these humans had only just begun putting small colonies on nearby moons and planets, and they had basic nuclear power and simple rockets that burned chemical fuel, and their weapons were laughably outdated compared to Krell technology because the Krell had engines that could bend space itself. And they had plasma cannons that could crack planets in half, and their shields could withstand the heat from exploding stars. Vexthor gave the order to begin the attack, and 3,000 Krell warships moved toward Earth like a dark cloud blotting out the stars, and the first wave of fighters descended on the human orbital stations, and the humans fought back with railguns and missiles. But their weapons barely scratched the Krell shields before the stations exploded into clouds of debris, and on the surface below the cities activated emergency sirens as enormous alien ships appeared in the sky and unleashed beams of superheated energy that carved glowing trenches through buildings and streets. Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat in the cockpit of his F-97 Raptor fighter jet and listened to the alarms screaming through his helmet, and he watched through his canopy as alien spacecraft tore through the clouds like falling meteors, and each one left trails of fire in their wake. And his commander, Helen Brooks, came over the radio and told all squadrons to launch immediately because they needed to buy time for civilians to reach the underground shelters. Jake and his squadron lifted off into a sky filled with smoke and falling wreckage, and they were completely outmatched because the Krell had better weapons and better shields, and there were so many of them that they darkened the sun. But Jake and the other pilots flew anyway, because that was what humans did when faced with impossible odds, and they fought even when logic said they should run away and hide. The battle lasted 6 terrible hours, and Earth's military forces managed to destroy some Krell ships, which surprised the aliens, because no primitive species should have been able to fight back so effectively. But the outcome was never really in doubt, and when the guns finally went silent and the smoke began to clear, Commander Vexthor sent a message to Earth that was simple and harsh, because he told them to surrender completely and immediately, or watch their entire world burn, until nothing remained but ashes and dust. Deep underground in a bunker 3 miles beneath what used to be Geneva, Secretary General Martin Cole stood before the Emergency Council and looked at the faces of the surviving government leaders, and some of them wanted to surrender because they thought it would save lives, while others demanded they keep fighting even if it meant everyone would die, and the room erupted in arguments and shouting until Martin raised his hand for silence. Dr. Lisa Park stepped forward, and she was the director of the Deep Space Research Initiative, and she pulled up classified files on the holographic display that floated in the center of the room, and she told them about Project Threshold, and the room became completely silent as they read the files and understood what she was proposing. One of the council members protested that Project Threshold was just theoretical science, and they had never successfully tested it, and it might not work at all, or it might kill everyone who tried to use it. But Lisa looked at him with tired eyes and said they were out of options because they could either try this experimental technology, or they could become slaves to an empire that had been conquering worlds since before humans discovered fire. Martin looked around at the desperate and terrified faces and asked Lisa how long it would take to activate Project Threshold, and she told him 72 hours or maybe less if they ignored all the safety protocols and cut every corner they could. And Martin made his decision immediately, because he told her to cut every safety measure and send orders to every remaining research facility, because humanity was not going to surrender, and they were going to show the Krell what happens when you corner a species that refuses to die quietly. Above them, the Krell fleet settled into positions around Earth's orbit, and the alien commanders felt confident and secure, because they had crushed the human defenses, and now they just had to wait for the inevitable surrender. And they had done this same thing to hundreds of other species, and it always ended the same way, with the conquered people accepting their new masters and learning to serve the Dominion. But the Krell had never encountered a species quite like humanity before, and they did not understand what made humans different from all the others, because humans had spent their entire evolutionary history climbing to the top of their food chain, not through superior strength or speed, but through something more dangerous than physical power, and that something was the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain and inevitable. In the underground facilities scattered across Earth's remaining continents, the word went out to prepare Project Threshold, and scientists and technicians worked frantically to ready equipment that had never been fully tested, and volunteers began arriving at the research centers because they knew what was being asked of them, and they knew the risks, but they came anyway, because their world needed them. Jake Morrison was pulled from the medical bay where doctors were treating his injuries from the battle, and he was taken to a facility beneath the Antarctic ice, and they explained to him what Project Threshold was supposed to do, and he listened, carefully even though he did not completely understand the science. But he understood enough to know that this was dangerous and experimental, and might kill everyone involved. They sat him in a strange chair covered with wires and electrodes, and technicians attached sensors to his head and arms and chest. And when Jake asked what exactly he was supposed to do, they told him to think and remember and feel, because they were going to take his consciousness and amplify it and project it outward into space, and Jake thought that sounded completely insane, but he agreed, because what other choice did they have? All across Earth in 18 different facilities, 12,000 volunteers prepared to link their minds together through technology that barely existed, and each volunteer knew they might die or worse. But they also knew that if they did nothing, then humanity would certainly become slaves, and so they made their choice and they climbed into the neural interface chairs and waited for the countdown to begin. The effect rippled through the Krell fleet like a shockwave that existed in minds rather than physical space. And on every ship from the smallest fighter to the massive dreadnoughts, the alien crews staggered as something pressed against their consciousness with a weight that should not have been possible. And it was not pain exactly, but rather an overwhelming sense of presence that made it hard to think or breathe or remember why they had come to this small blue world in the first place. Commander Vexthor gripped the edge of his command console and tried to focus through the pressure filling his mind. And around him crew members collapsed at their stations, and some were making sounds of distress that the Krell language had no words for because they had never experienced anything like this before in 17,000 years of conquest and domination. The view screens showed Earth blazing with energy that sensors could not properly measure or classify because it was not heat or radiation or any form of electromagnetic emission, and instead it seemed to be something fundamental that existed in the space between thought and reality. And it pulsed outward in waves that touched every ship and every crew member with the same message repeated over and over. No, Jake Morrison existed in a state beyond normal consciousness because he was still himself, but also part of something much larger. And through the neural link, he could feel 11,999 other humans connected to him, and their combined awareness stretched across space, touching the minds of the Krell and showing them things the aliens had never imagined possible. Through the quantum field, Jake could sense the Krell's confusion and growing fear, and that gave him a fierce satisfaction because these beings had come to conquer humanity without a second thought, and now they were learning what it meant to face a species that refused to surrender, and he pushed harder, sending more of himself into the field, and the other volunteers did the same. Lisa Park watched her instruments spike into ranges that should have been impossible, and the power consumption was burning through their reserves faster than predicted, and several generators had already overloaded and shut down. But the quantum field continued to grow, because it was feeding on something more than electricity now, and it was drawing power from the collective will of humanity itself. The Krell tried to fight back in the only way they knew how, and their weapon systems activated and plasma cannons fired at Earth's surface, but the beams passed through the quantum field and simply disappeared as if the energy had been absorbed or redirected somewhere beyond normal space, and the Krell captains ordered more firing, and still nothing penetrated the shield that humanity had created from pure consciousness. Vexthor demanded answers from his science officer, but Zetric could barely speak, because the pressure in his mind was too intense. And when he finally managed to form words, he said something that Vexthor had never heard from a Krell scientist before. And he said they were facing a weapon that should not exist according to any known principles of physics or warfare. The quantum field intensified, and suddenly the Krell began to see images flowing through their consciousness, and they saw Earth's history playing out before them like they were experiencing human memories directly, and they saw humans fighting, wars against each other and surviving plagues and famines and building civilizations from nothing. And every time humanity was knocked down, they got back up and tried again. Jake showed them what it meant to be human, and he shared memories of his daughter's first steps and the way his wife smiled in the morning sunlight, and the feeling of flying his fighter jet through clouds at sunset, and he showed them the rage he felt when Krell plasma beams destroyed his home city and killed people he loved. And through the neural link, thousands of other volunteers shared their own memories, creating a flood of human experience that overwhelmed the Krell's ability to process it. The aliens began to understand something they had never encountered before, because every species they had conquered had fought with weapons and tactics and military strategy. But humans were fighting with something deeper and more primal, and they were showing the Krell that conquest was not just about destroying ships and occupying territory, but about breaking the spirit of a people. And humanity's spirit refused to break. Vexthor watched as some of his ships began breaking formation and moving away from Earth without orders, and their captains were overwhelmed by the psychic pressure and could not maintain discipline and control. And Vexthor realized with growing horror that his fleet was falling apart not from weapons fire, but from the sheer force of human will pressing against them. The quantum field carried a message that every Krell could understand even though it was not transmitted in their language, and the message was simple and absolute, because it said that Earth belonged to humanity, and any species that tried to take it would face resistance beyond anything they had ever experienced. And the message promised that humans would burn themselves to ashes before accepting slavery. Jake felt his body beginning to fail because the neural interface was pushing his mind beyond human limits, and he could feel blood vessels bursting in his brain and his heart racing at dangerous speeds, and he knew he was dying, but he refused to let go of the connection because if he died while holding the line, then his death would mean something. Across the 18 facilities, volunteers were suffering the same fate, and some had already died and others were so damaged they would never fully recover. But they held on anyway because they understood what was at stake, and they poured everything they had into the quantum field until there was nothing left to give. Lisa watched the casualty reports climbing, and she wanted to shut down the system and save the volunteers who were still alive. But she knew that stopping now would mean humanity's defeat, and so she kept the power flowing, and hated herself for the choice she was making. The Krell High Command, 300 light-years away, received reports from Vexthor's fleet, and they could not believe what they were reading, because a primitive species had somehow created a weapon that bypassed shields and armor and struck directly at consciousness itself, and if word of this spread, then every conquered world in the Dominion would seek similar weapons, and the Empire would face rebellions on a scale never seen before. Vexthor made a decision that no Krell commander had made in thousands of years, and he opened a communication channel to Earth and requested negotiations, because continuing the attack would only result in more casualties for a fleet that could not defend against an enemy that existed partially outside normal reality. Martin Cole received the message in his bunker and stared at the screen in disbelief because the Krell were actually asking for peace. And that meant Project Threshold had worked, and humanity had survived. But the price was measured in the screams of volunteers who were burning themselves out to keep the quantum field active. The void had roared, and it had spoken in humanity's voice, and the galaxy's greatest empire had been forced to listen. Dr. Lisa Park had not slept in 48 hours, and her eyes burned with exhaustion as she moved through the underground facility known as Site Omega, which was buried beneath 2 miles of Antarctic ice, and all around her scientists and technicians worked frantically to prepare equipment that had never been tested outside of computer simulations, and the air hummed with barely contained energy as massive generators powered up, and the temperature in the laboratory dropped several degrees. Despite the heating systems running at full capacity, Project Threshold had begun as a theoretical experiment years ago, when physicists discovered something strange about human consciousness, and they found that the human mind generated a unique pattern of quantum fluctuations that could interact with the fabric of space and time itself in ways that should have been impossible, according to everything they knew about physics. And after years of research, they developed technology that could amplify these quantum patterns and project them outward like a signal broadcasting into the void. Lisa had tried to explain it to the council in simple terms, but the truth was, she did not fully understand how it worked. and the best comparison she could make was that they were turning human thoughts and emotions and willpower into a weapon that existed somewhere between energy and consciousness, and it defied every law of physics she had studied. But the mathematics worked, and the simulations showed it was possible, even if those same simulations also predicted catastrophic side effects for anyone connected to the system. Jake Morrison sat in his neural interface chair and felt electrodes being attached to various points on his skull, and the technicians spoke in quiet, urgent voices as they calibrated the equipment and adjusted settings, and Jake tried not to think about what was about to happen, because thinking about it made his hands shake and his heart race, so instead he focused on breathing slowly and steadily, the way he had been taught during pilot training. A technician named Peter Grant approached Jake's chair with a tablet computer and asked Jake to sign a consent form, and Jake read through it quickly and saw phrases like potential neural damage and irreversible cognitive impairment and possibility of death. And he signed it anyway because what choice did he have when the alternative was watching his entire species become slaves to an alien empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds? Lisa's voice came through the facility's intercom system, and she announced that they were beginning the connection sequence, and all volunteers should prepare for neural interface activation, and Jake felt his stomach clench with fear, but he forced himself to remain calm and still as the chair began to hum with power, and he felt something cold and electric spreading through his body, starting from the electrodes on his head. Across the planet in 17 other facilities, the same scene was playing out as thousands of volunteers prepared to link their consciousness together through quantum entanglement, and each person brought their own memories and emotions and experiences, and all of it would be combined and amplified and projected outward, like humanity's collective voice screaming into the darkness of space. Jake closed his eyes, and suddenly he was not alone in his own mind, because he could feel other presences connecting to him, like threads being woven into a tapestry, and each thread was another human consciousness, and he felt their fear and determination and hope and anger and love for their world, and it was overwhelming at first, but then he found himself settling into the sensation and accepting it. The neural link grew stronger, and Jake felt his sense of self beginning to blur at the edges because he was still Jake Morrison, but he was also beginning to merge with the collective consciousness of 12,000 other humans, and through their combined awareness he could sense things beyond normal human perception, and he felt the quantum field building around Earth like an invisible shield made of pure willpower. Lisa watched her instruments carefully, as readings climbed toward theoretical maximums and the power consumption was enormous, because they were drawing electricity from every available source, including nuclear reactors and solar arrays and geothermal plants, and still it barely seemed enough to sustain the quantum field they were generating. And she knew that once they activated the projection system, the power requirements would double or triple. Commander Vexthor sat in his command chamber aboard the Eternal Dominance and reviewed reports from the fleet, and the humans had gone silent after his ultimatum, which usually meant they were preparing to surrender, and he expected their leaders would contact him within the next few hours to negotiate terms, and he was already planning how to divide the human population among the Dominion's labor colonies, when suddenly every alarm on his ship began screaming at once. The Krell sensors detected something impossible happening on Earth's surface, because energy readings were spiking across 18 different locations, and the pattern did not match any known weapon system or defensive technology, and what made it even stranger was that the energy seemed to be quantum in nature, which meant it existed in multiple states simultaneously, and conventional sensors could barely track it. Vexthor demanded an explanation from his science officer Zetrick, who was frantically analyzing the data and trying to make sense of readings that contradicted everything the Krell knew about physics. And Zetrick finally looked up with confusion in his multifaceted eyes and said, "The humans appeared to be generating a field that interacted with consciousness itself." And Vexthor asked what that meant, and Zetrick admitted he had no idea, because nothing like this had ever been documented in 17,000 years of Krell expansion. In Site Omega, the countdown reached its final seconds, and Lisa placed her hand on the activation console, and she thought about her daughter who had died in the initial Krell bombardment, and she thought about her husband who was somewhere in another facility preparing to sacrifice himself just like she was about to sacrifice 12,000 volunteers, and she thought about Earth and humanity and everything worth fighting for. Jake felt the quantum field intensify and his consciousness expanded outward beyond his physical body, and beyond the facility, and beyond Earth itself. And he could feel the Krell fleet hanging in orbit like dark shapes against the stars, and he could sense their confidence and their certainty that they had already won. And that made something hot and fierce burn in his chest because they had no idea what was coming. Lisa activated Project Threshold and the quantum field exploded outward from Earth, traveling faster than light, because it was not bound by conventional physics, and it carried with it the combined consciousness of 12,000 humans who were thinking and feeling and remembering everything that made them human, and the field touched the Krell ships and passed through their shields like those shields did not exist. Vexthor felt it first as a pressure against his mind and then as something far more powerful and incomprehensible, because suddenly there was a presence filling his consciousness, and it was vast and terrible and utterly alien to his experience. And it was not speaking in words but in pure emotion and intent, and what it said was simple and absolute. No. The negotiations took place on a neutral station that was hastily built at a point in space between Earth and the Krell fleet, and the structure was simple and functional, with sections constructed from both human and Krell materials, as a gesture toward potential cooperation, and inside the station 2 species that had been trying to destroy each other now sat across a table trying to find a path forward that did not end in mutual destruction. Secretary General Martin Cole led the human delegation, and beside him sat Dr. Lisa Park, whose knowledge of quantum technology made her essential to any discussions, and surprisingly Jake Morrison was also present despite his injuries because he had insisted on attending, and Martin had agreed because the Krell needed to see what their invasion had cost humanity. Jake looked like a man who had aged 30 years in 3 days, and his left eye had gone completely white from neural damage, and his hands shook constantly, and he moved slowly, like every step caused pain. But he sat straight in his chair and met the Krell's multifaceted eyes without flinching. Commander Vexthor arrived with several military officers and scientists, and the Krell were tall insectoid beings with crystalline exoskeletons that reflected light in strange patterns, and their movements were precise and mechanical, and their faces showed no emotion that humans could recognize. Vexthor spoke first, and his words were translated by computers into human language, and he said the Krell Dominion acknowledged that the invasion had proven costly to both sides, and he proposed terms that included withdrawal of Krell forces and recognition of human sovereignty over their star system, in exchange for humanity sharing the quantum weapon technology and agreeing not to give it to other species. Lisa shook her head before Vexthor finished speaking, and she said humanity would never hand over the one weapon that kept the Krell from returning to finish their conquest, and she asked why humanity should trust an empire that had spent 17,000 years conquering everyone they encountered. Vexthor's mandibles clicked in what might have been frustration, and he said humans did not understand galactic politics and the Dominion maintained order across hundreds of systems, and without Krell authority there would be chaos and war between species. Jake laughed, and the sound was bitter and harsh, and he said the Krell meant that without their authority, species might actually be free to determine their own futures, and he leaned forward and told Vexthor that humans had spent their entire history fighting tyrants and kings and dictators, and every generation learned that freedom was not given, but taken, and once taken it was never surrendered. Vexthor said they had reached an impasse, and Martin interrupted and said no. They had reached an opportunity because the Krell had just learned that military power alone was not enough, and humanity had a weapon that worked on consciousness itself, and neither side fully understood it, and it might eventually kill everyone who used it, but it was real and it worked, and humanity was keeping it. Martin displayed star maps on a holographic screen and presented humanity's counter-proposal, and he said the Krell must withdraw completely from human space, including not just Earth but all planets and moons within 20 light-years, and this territory would become neutral ground. And in exchange humanity would agree not to share quantum technology with other species without both sides agreeing. The Krell science officer named Zetrick protested that this would leave the Dominion vulnerable to attacks from species who might develop similar weapons, and Lisa replied that now the Krell knew how every species they had conquered felt, and the difference was that humanity was offering a choice instead of demanding submission. She told them they could leave humanity alone and humanity would leave them alone, or they could force the issue, and humanity would make sure every enslaved species in the Krell Empire learned that the mighty Dominion could be stopped by primitives who refused to surrender. Fexthor was silent for a long time, and his posture showed tension that the other Krell could recognize, even if humans could not. And finally he said he would need to consult with High Command, but he believed humanity's terms might be acceptable, though he suspected this would fundamentally change the balance of power in the galaxy. Martin said that was exactly the point, and the negotiations continued for 3 weeks while both sides worked out details and established protocols. And during that time, Jake visited the medical facilities where other Project Threshold volunteers were recovering from neural damage. He found a woman named Amy Wright in one of the recovery rooms, and she had been a surgeon before the invasion and volunteered for Project Threshold to save lives, and now she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and her mind was so damaged by neural feedback that she could no longer speak or recognize faces or understand where she was. Jake sat beside Amy's bed and talked to her, even though he knew she could not understand his words, and he told her that the Krell were leaving, and Earth was safe. And he said that what she had done mattered because she had helped save 7 billion people, and that had to count for something even if the price was too high. He stayed with her for an hour talking about nothing and everything, and knowing his words meant nothing to her damaged mind, but needing to say them anyway, because someone had to remember who Amy Wright had been before Project Threshold burned away pieces of her consciousness. The treaty was finally signed after 3 weeks of negotiations, and the Krell Dominion agreed to withdraw all forces from human space and recognize Earth's sovereignty, and in exchange humanity would keep quantum technology confidential and establish a non-aggression pact, and trade would be possible but not required, and neither side would interfere in the other's affairs. Most importantly, both sides agreed to the Void Protocol, which stated that if any species developed consciousness-based weapons, then both Krell and humans would work together to contain the technology, because they had stumbled into a new form of warfare, and both sides recognized how dangerous it could become if it spread unchecked across the galaxy. As the Krell fleet departed from Earth's orbit, people poured into the streets in celebration, and they were crying and laughing and holding each other because they had survived, and the small primitive species from the outer edge of the galaxy had faced the greatest empire known to exist and forced them to retreat. But in the underground facilities where Project Threshold had operated, the celebrations were quiet and sad, because 12,000 volunteers had connected their minds to create the quantum field, and more than 200 were dead, and hundreds more would never fully recover, and they had burned pieces of their consciousness to save humanity, and the cost would never be forgotten. Lisa stood in Site Omega looking at the empty neural interface chairs, and she thought about how humanity had changed because they were not quite the same species they had been before, and they had learned to weaponize will itself, and that knowledge changed everything. The treaty changed everything, and the Krell fleet departed from human space and left behind only observation posts at the border of the 20-light-year neutral zone, and Earth began the slow process of rebuilding cities and infrastructure that had been destroyed during the invasion, and life gradually returned to something resembling normal, though nothing would ever be quite the same as it had been before. Secretary General Martin Cole addressed the United Nations General Assembly in a hastily rebuilt chamber, and he spoke about humanity's responsibility now that they had proven the Krell could be defeated, and he said there were thousands of species across the galaxy, and many of them lived under Dominion rule and suffered the same fate Earth had nearly experienced. He told the Assembly that humanity had a choice, and they could hide behind their quantum shield and hope the galaxy left them alone, or they could reach out carefully and cautiously and offer other species what the Krell had tried to take away, which was hope that resistance was possible and that empires could be challenged. The debate lasted for days, and some representatives argued that humanity should focus on recovery and avoid galactic politics entirely, while others insisted that having survived the invasion gave them a moral obligation to help other species. And finally, after much discussion, the Assembly voted to establish diplomatic contact with other worlds. Jake Morrison died 3 years after the treaty was signed, and his body, which had been pushed far beyond human limits, simply gave out, despite the best efforts of doctors and cybernetic enhancements, and before he died he recorded a message for future generations that would be played in schools across Earth. In the recording, Jake looked tired and old, and his white eye seemed to glow in the lighting, and he spoke slowly and carefully, and he said people would ask if the price they paid was worth it, and if saving humanity justified the cost of so many volunteers who had burned themselves out in the neural interface chairs. He said he could only speak for himself, and he had seen his world about to be enslaved, and he had been given a chance to stop it, even if that chance meant destroying himself in the process, and he had taken it, and he would take it again, because that was what humans did when faced with impossible choices. Jake said humans saw impossible situations and tried anyway, and they faced the void and made it listen, and they spoke, and sometimes if they were loud enough and brave enough and stubborn enough, the universe spoke back in their language, and he told future generations to remember that their voices mattered, even when they felt small and powerless. He said they should shout into the darkness and make it know they were there and make it know they would not go quietly. And that was what it meant to be human. And the recording ended with Jake smiling slightly and saying he had no regrets. 6 months after Jake's death, the first human diplomatic ship departed for neutral space, carrying ambassadors who would attempt contact with species that lived on the borders of Krell territory, and the ship was small and lightly armed because humanity wanted to show they came in peace, but the crew carried with them a simple message. The message explained that humanity had survived a Krell invasion despite being technologically inferior, and they had survived by refusing to surrender and by developing a weapon based on consciousness and will rather than conventional technology. And the message was careful not to share specific details about quantum technology, but it made clear that the Krell were not invincible. The message spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected, and some species dismissed it as propaganda, while others saw it as inspiration. And on 17 different worlds that were under Krell occupation, rebellions began within a year of receiving humanity's message. The Krell tried to suppress the information, but it was too late because every subjugated species had learned that the mighty Dominion could be defeated, and more importantly, they had learned how, because humanity had not won through superior weapons, but through absolute refusal to accept defeat. Commander Vexathor, who had retired from military service and now worked as an ambassador, met with Martin Cole one final time on the neutral station, where they had negotiated the original treaty, and Vexathor said humanity had doomed the galaxy to chaos because the order the Dominion maintained was collapsing. Martin replied that maybe it was time for a new kind of order and one built on cooperation instead of conquest. And Vexathor said Martin was naive because the strong would always dominate the weak, and that was the nature of existence itself. Martin told him that maybe the weak could make themselves too expensive to dominate, and that was what humanity had taught the galaxy, and the Krell could have their empire, or they could have peace, but they could no longer have both. Vexathor was silent for a long moment and then said humanity was either the galaxy's salvation or its doom, and time would tell which, and Martin agreed and said that was true for every species, and the difference was humanity was willing to find out. 50 years after the invasion, the Krell Dominion had fractured into 17 separate governments, and some were democratic, while others remained authoritarian. But none could claim the absolute power the Dominion once held, and humanity had not conquered the galaxy through force but had done something more effective. They had given every oppressed species a voice and shown them how to make it heard, and the quantum shield around Earth eventually faded as its energy dissipated back into the void. But the memory of what humanity had done remained, and the galaxy would never forget. Dr. Lisa Park lived to see the 50th anniversary of the invasion, and she gave an interview where she was asked if she regretted creating Project Threshold, knowing the cost in human lives and neural damage, and she was quiet for a long time before answering. She said regret was complicated because she regretted every death and every damaged mind and every volunteer who had sacrificed themselves. But she did not regret that humanity survived, and she said the volunteers had known the risks and made their choice, and that choice saved billions of lives. When asked what she thought humanity's legacy would be, Lisa said that humans had taught the galaxy something important, and they had shown that resistance was never futile, and freedom was always worth fighting for, and sometimes when you screamed loud enough into the void, it screamed back on your behalf. The story of humanity's first contact was told across 1,000 worlds, and each version was slightly different, but the core message remained the same, and it said that a small, primitive species faced the galaxy's greatest empire and refused to surrender, and in that refusal, they changed everything. The void had roared, and it spoke in human tongue, and the galaxy learned that empires fall and tyrants can be stopped, and freedom has a voice that cannot be silenced, and that voice belonged to anyone brave enough to use it regardless of how small or weak they seemed. Humanity's gift to the galaxy was not technology or weapons, but rather the simple truth that survival was a choice, and surrender was optional, and sometimes the only thing standing between slavery and freedom was the willingness to fight, even when logic said you should give up.